Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Adam Smith's Panmure House. I'm Professor Adam Dixon, the Adam Smith Chair here, and it's my pleasure to welcome you in Adam Smith's last home, the moral philosopher whose ideas about markets, liberty, and government still shape the way we think about the world. And our job here at Panmure House is to bring Smith's home, his last home, back to life, not as a relic of the past, not as a museum that honors Smith as this great thinker, but to take his ideas and many of the ideas of his contemporaries and those that have used his ideas through the centuries and think about the problems and challenges that we face as a society, not simply here in Scotland or Britain, but everywhere around the world, because Smith's ideas have traveled and traveled far. And I would say Smith is actually more famous in other parts of the world than he is here in Scotland. But we're trying to change that by inviting audiences such as yourself to this beautiful, sunny Edinburgh evening in June. Now, tonight we're tackling a big, complicated, and sometimes messy question, and that is what happens when classical liberal principles meet the political realities. And not simply of the Trump era, though Trump, I think, is in many of our minds as this interesting political entrepreneur that scares some people in many ways, enthuses others, but one that nonetheless needs to be reckoned with and considered. Now, the current occupant of the White House, even though he is the hook for this evening, it is also true that in the last years and across other administrations, and not simply in the United States of America, but in other countries, they've tested the long-held assumptions about markets and the value of markets in society, the role of government, issues around individual liberty. What are we free to do as individuals? What are we free to say? And obviously, the role of the state generally. Now, we thought it was time to gather, given the situation that we're in, some of the sharp minds that are considering these questions to talk it through in the last home of Adam Smith, no less. And we've got a fantastic panel lined up for you. To my left here, sitting to my left, or right next to me, is Samuel Gregg, who is the president of the American Institute of Economic Research. He's a prolific writer and, in my view, one of the clearest defenders of economic liberty. He is Australian by birth, as his pseudo-English accent we were discussing earlier may contend. You'll hear a bit of an Australian twinge to it, but he's also an American citizen and has long lived in the United States and can speak as an American on the issue. To his left, we have Helen Dale, also Australian. It wasn't by design, it just kind of happened that way that we had Australians. An award-winning writer, legal scholar, and commentator who's never afraid, certainly, to ruffle a few feathers in the name of reason. And one, I should note, worked as a solicitor here in Edinburgh some years ago, so understands Scotland and some of Scotland's political and economic issues. Though now she lives in the country down south, that country called England. To her left is Veronique de Rugy, who, although is French by birth, is also a proud American. Again, this wasn't by design, but it just happened to be that. Who is the George Gibbs Chair in Political Economy at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. She's an economist known for her libertarian views, a columnist, and a relentless critic of cronyism and big government meddling, as you would expect from someone on the libertarian view of the world. Now, I want to also say and give a big thank you to Ryan Streeter, who's here with us this evening, who is the executive director of the Civitas Institute at the University of Texas at Austin. So raise your hand, Ryan. For making this event possible and collaborating with us. Earlier today, we had a colloquium with a small group of us to discuss the ongoing significance of the Scottish Enlightenment. And Ryan in Texas and Austin is focusing at their new think tank on what makes a free and flourishing society tick. And that's exactly what we're hoping to explore tonight. and through our collaboration ensure that the ideas that were generated in this house, in Adam Smith's house, are also considered in the United States and vice versa, where much innovation and discussion is happening on the future of liberalism, classical liberalism, that is. Now we'll kick off with some opening remarks from each of the panelists. I've invited them to spend 5 to 7 minutes giving a statement of their view on Trump and what Trump means and the politics or the political moment that we are in. And then we'll have a bit of a panel discussion that I'll moderate. And then, because we want to ensure that Panmure House is truly a home of social and economic debate, that each of you has the opportunity to ask hard questions of me if you want, but please actually ask it of our panelists who have graciously given their time and their energy to, I hope, give you insight, but also entertain you, because it is the evening. So on that note, I'm going to pass over to Sam Gregg, who will give some initial thoughts to us. Thank you, Sam, please.
Well, thank you, Adam. Thank you, Ryan. It's great to be here. I should mention that my ancestors came from this country about almost 200 years ago. And I've been back here many times. I always like coming to Edinburgh. I always like coming to Scotland. But I'm going to talk about America for a few moments tonight. What I thought I'd do is set some of the context for how I think we need to understand the emergence of Donald Trump, but more generally, this type of populist movement across the West that's going on right now. So I think if you're thinking about the United States and trying to understand how is it that the United States ends up with a person like Donald Trump as president, context, I think, explains a lot. So in the first place, I think one big context is a long-term shift away from the consensus that marked much of the Western world from about 1980 until around about 2008, which was a consensus that had formed around market economies, skepticism about government intervention, favorable views of trade liberalization, stable money, all these types of things. And in the United States, that had pretty much emerged on the right of the Republican Party, but then steadily made its way across the political spectrum. And if you look at a Democrat like Bill Clinton, very much a trade liberalizer, very skeptical about industrial policy, someone who engaged in welfare reform. If you're a free market person, Bill Clinton doesn't look so bad these days. Now, that being said, there was always an underlying skepticism about this move towards markets, I think, not just on the political left, but some sections of the right in America as well. I'm thinking, for example, of someone like Pat Buchanan, who challenged George H.W. Bush for the Republican nomination back in 1992. And what was he arguing for? He was arguing for protectionism. He was arguing for a pseudo-isolationist foreign policy and expressing deep concern about what he thought was happening to the American working class, all themes that Donald Trump has articulated in both his presidential runs. I think another factor which has changed matters, of course, was the 2008 financial crisis. I think that severely damaged the case for markets in America and around the world. Now, I happen to think that most of that crisis was a result of bad government policy, but it doesn't matter. The other side won the public argument about that. Another factor, I think, of course, is the rise of China and the way that trade liberalization plays into that discussion, as well as the geopolitical questions that has raised for the United States and its place in the world. Now, China has been empowered by trade liberalization. It helped make it a wealthier country. It also made America wealthier in terms of Americans paying less for goods, having export markets, etc. There was also the change of the regime in Beijing, moving away from Deng's approach to much more towards Xi's approach. And Xi is much more state-orientated, much more of an authentic communist, and much more focused upon Chinese identity and China's role in the world. And that has also done some significant damage to the classical liberal brand, because it turns out that trade liberalization doesn't necessarily change the nature of regimes. And then some of you will remember in the late 1980s, Francis Fukuyama and his book, The End of History and the Last Man, basically arguing that the future belonged to democracy and liberal markets, and it was just a question of how fast everyone got there. Well, that turned out not to be true. China shows that that turns out not to be true, and that did a lot of damage, I think, to the classical liberal brand. And as for foreign policy, the rise of China has forced the United States to start reassessing a lot of its global geopolitical priorities. And this didn't begin with Trump. I can distinctly recall President Barack Obama in 2012 saying that European countries had to stop being deadbeats when it came to military expenditures. Barack Obama, right, very much on the left in the United States, basically saying, the rise of China has forced a rearrangement of American priorities. Europeans need to start spending more on their defense. Donald Trump says the same thing. So when we think about that, we see some very clear parallels. Another factor, I think, which has played a big role is something we were talking about just before, which is undermining of confidence in elites. That's happened across the Western world. The financial crisis is a very good example of that. So was the response of governments to the COVID pandemic. We now know that we were effectively lied to by many experts. Governments effectively handed over policy to epidemiologists. The lockdown policies turned out to be either ineffective, had lots of counterproductive effects, etc. But my point generally speaking is that this lack of confidence in elites and experts has damaged, in many cases, the capacity of elites to articulate a particular narrative that is capable of countering some of the things that Donald Trump has said and done. So when you think about all those different factors, I think the question is, it starts to become, well, it's sort of more obvious now, if you think about that context, why someone like Donald Trump emerged. Think about it this way. He's not seen as an expert. In fact, he expresses contempt for experts. He's always been a skeptic about trade liberalization. He's always had an essentially mercantilist view of the economy in the world. He's always had a very skeptical view of American involvement abroad. He's unabashedly American in his patriotism. And he's also seen as not a member of the elites. Now, he actually is, when you consider his background and where he went to school and where he went to college, but he's very successfully presented himself as, I'm not one of them. I'm not one of these people who have, quote unquote, betrayed you, who dislike you, who hate you, etc. So that's another factor, I think, is that when you think about these things, it starts to become more obvious why someone like a Trump would emerge. And I think another thing that's worth thinking about here is, what is Donald Trump's superpower? Donald Trump's superpower is the radicalization of the left in the United States. The hard radicalization of the left in the United States. By which I mean things like the acceleration of the narrative on the left that the history of America is all about patriarchy, racism, and economic exploitation. The radical wokeness that dominates American universities, the Democratic Party, and large segments of corporate America. Donald Trump, and the visible disdain that you hear from many of these people for ordinary Americans. And this, I think, has also been accelerated by some of the policies of the Biden administration. So, for example, the effective open borders has severely damaged the case for migration in the United States. The lawlessness of the Biden administration effectively refusing to enforce laws about immigration. Now, you might disagree with those laws, you might have problems with those laws, but then you should reform those laws. You just don't stop enforcing them, which is essentially what the Biden administration did, and then claimed that it was enforcing the law. So when you think about that, you can start to see that that creates problems that are going to push people in the direction of someone like Donald Trump, who says, I'll close the borders. That's a very attractive message to a lot of Americans. I could go on and talk about the attempts of the Biden administration to circumvent the Constitution, such as their endless efforts to try and engage in student loan forgiveness after being knocked back time and time again by the Supreme Court. I could talk about the Biden administration's efforts to use the administrative state to push DEI on the entire country. I can also talk about things like the systematic effort of legacy media to cover up the failures of the Biden administration, but also the fact that the president was not of right mind for 4 years. We know that now. So I think Trump is seen as a type of response in many cases to these types of positions. So he's unambiguously anti-woke. He's not ambiguous about what he thinks about America. He's rejected trade liberalization. He's deeply hostile to elites. He ended the lawlessness of the border, what was going on at the border. And he too is now pushing constitutional limits, but so too have progressives in the United States since the 1910s. So all of this adds up to enormous problems for classical liberals. And I'm going to conclude here because they're not welcome on the radical left in America. They're also now not welcome on large segments of the political right. The classical liberal position on things like constitutionalism, markets, civil society, the nature and role of the state has become politically marginalized. It has no real home in the United States right now. And this all, I think, indicates that classical liberals are not in the 1980s anymore. It's a very, very different world. And I would argue that at least some classical liberals have had enormous difficulty adjusting to this new reality. So I will close there. Thank you.
So I will let Sam sit back in his seat, and I will welcome Helen. And there is plenty of opportunity to ask Sam questions based on what he says. So please start getting your questions going. Helen, please.
Yeah. Any particular house rules about the microphone or anything?
Just talk loudly.
Just, all right, I shall attempt to talk loudly. I'm not an economist. I didn't even do an economics A-level. I'm a solicitor, retired now, but I did have some time in Australia as a barrister, which is an advocate here in Scotland, the other arm of the profession, the ones that wear the wigs and gowns. I still have the gown. My cat sleeps on it. It's full of cat hair. So I am going to address the question that Adam asked about the emergence of Donald Trump using a legal argument rather than an economics one. I figure I should stick to my knitting. Those of you, are there any Scots lawyers here? Any advocates or solicitors?
One tap at hand.
Yeah. You will remember being taught in your evidence course at one of the Scottish universities, which going back in the past would have been probably Edinburgh or Glasgow. St Andrews famously doesn't have a law school. You will have been taught the principle from the law of evidence of falsus in uno, falsus in omnibus. And you can tell from the Latin that it's of considerable antiquity, but it didn't just emerge in Roman law, it emerged independently in the common law and is applied widely throughout both the common law and the civil law world. The logic of it is, because it's an evidentiary rule, is that if you lie or omit an important fact about a fact in issue, that is something that is relevant to the proof, the trial of the case, it throws everything else that comes out of your mouth into question. So it's not irrebuttable. As far as I'm aware, no modern jurisdiction says that if you lie about one thing in the box, it means you've lied about everything. That may have applied at some point historically, but it doesn't now. But it does mean that you have to work, and your counsel have to work, your advisors, very hard to remove the whiff of bullshiter from you. Okay, you have to work. And just a little bit of Latin grammar here, the omnibus is an ablative, and in this case it indicates movements towards, which is why that is sometimes translated as false in one thing, therefore false in all others, because it indicates movement towards a pattern of repeated lying. Now, it's not only lawyers, starting with the Roman jurists, who use this idea. It's also had influence in theology, and among theologians it tends to be used in this way. If you have an untruth at the heart of your ethical or religious system, what else are you wrong about? What else have you got wrong? And Sam spoke earlier about the difficulties that classical liberals are having as a result of often being completely on the wrong side, but sometimes partially on the wrong side of things like the socio-political effect of trade liberalisation on authoritarian regimes. That was completely false about China. That's just one of those things, but they were completely false. But in more recent times, there have been far more egregious mistakes made by people on our side of the political aisle, if you want to put us on a side. Very large numbers of classical liberals, and in America, libertarians, bought into the idea that men could be women. That tends to blow a big hole in your ethical system. It wasn't terribly good that in the home of the Scottish Enlightenment and in a country that came up with this extraordinary mixed legal system, which Scotland has, the only genuinely successful example of a mixed legal system in the world is the Scottish one, and it's remarkable, it's extraordinary. It fed into the Scottish Enlightenment. Has the inner house of the Court of Session, the apex court in this country, trying to say that the word woman can be defined differently in different parts of the same statute. Anyone who has drafted a commercial contract or a will, or has been involved in parliamentary drafting — I used to work at the Office of the Solicitor to the Scottish Parliament many years ago — would know that this is the way you break your legal system. This is the way you stop it from working. So classical liberals in many countries followed people who were not liberal. And I use liberal in the widest sense here. So you get left liberals, right liberals, and classical liberals. They are all somewhat different, but left liberals are a genuine thing that exists, and they're relatively common. I mean, Wes Streeting is a good example at the moment of a proper left liberal, and a person of very admirable character. So what happened to us is that, for a whole range of reasons that are worth exploring and discussing further, we followed people who were not liberal, who believed nonsense things off an ideological cliff. And it has contaminated our ability to be heard by association. And the heuristic that is being used on us is falsus in uno, falsus in omnibus. This has been extended more widely to the expert class. So much so that you see, for example, in places that had extended lockdowns all over the world, whether it's California or Victoria in Australia, they are two very notorious examples. And they're wonderful because federal systems provide you with the laboratory of the state, so you can see the difference between a state that didn't have very long lockdowns like Queensland and a state that had very long ones like Victoria. You find now, because people feel they've been traduced accurately for the reasons that Sam set out earlier, by the state and by its experts, vaccination rates in large parts of Victoria are now below what they are in South Sudan, because the experts soiled themselves. And okay, a lot of those experts were probably from a social democratic tradition and may not be people who are liberal. I mean, Sam is quite right to say that the Biden administration became completely bonkers and adopted many policies that Democrats of the more usual Bill Clinton left liberal sort would not recognise at all. That is true. But the point is, the Liberals and the rest of the party followed Biden over that cliff and then lied to the people of the United States about his fitness for office. It becomes very, very difficult to get a hearing after you've done that, and done it so publicly and so spectacularly. You just look, it looks like a nonsense. I feel like I'm getting up and if I were the defence advocate here, and you're allowed to use more rhetoric than the Fiscal is. The Fiscal has to sort of be quite restrained in the way they make their address to the jury. I feel like I'm engaging in excessive rhetoric by talking about this, but it has just been plain for everyone to see, and it has been pervasive, impossible to hide. And because it is the United States, the rest of the world has had a window into this great democracy tearing itself apart over precisely these issues. Now, because I'm a lawyer and because my background is to only make claims for things that I think are true, or where I have some evidence for them, I have to be honest and say, I don't know how to fix this. And the only suggestion I have made, and I have rehearsed it a little with everyone else here in the small colloquium we had earlier, is that I don't think the people of the United States or of Scotland or of all the other countries who've been traduced by dreadful lies from immigration is always good to men can be women to climate, the Green Party of various countries can care more about trans and Gaza than they do about climate change, all of these things that we've all seen. All I would suggest, based on client conferences, particularly in litigation, in delict litigation, has been an admission of wrongness is often more effective than an apology. Because everyone's had the experience of seeing at school level apologies forced out of little children. And not only do they hate each other afterwards, they also hate the teacher. Whereas being big enough to say, I was wrong about immigration, about trans, about Gaza, about whatever, being big enough to admit wrongness, I think would be the beginning, perhaps, of some improvement in the political fortunes of people who are broadly liberal in the widest sense, whether they are classical liberals, right liberals, or the left liberals who exist in the world. And Wes Streeting has made a good start with the trans stuff. So that's an example of a left liberal doing the right thing. But we are confronted, liberalism is in trouble, in real trouble, and a significant part of it, I am afraid, is our own doing.
Hi, everyone, on that happy note.
Cheer us up.
I'm an economist, and I'm going to kind of actually keep my remarks to mostly the economics sphere, actually exclusively on the economic spheres. And I mean, I'll start by defining a little bit in my head what classical liberal means when it applies to economics. And I think the way I would define it, or the way I would like to believe it means, is like smaller government. It means fiscal sustainability. It means believing in rules as opposed to rulers. It means believing in processes as opposed to outcomes. It means limiting power as opposed to redirecting power against your enemies. It believes in applying the rules or treating everyone in a general way as opposed to directed subsidies to your friends. And unfortunately on that front, actually the Trump administration is pretty much the opposite, at least as personified by the president himself. I think the administration itself and what the outcome will be, or the Republican Party, could be some silver lining, and I hope I will end by, please remind me to actually kind of say that there will be things that I think are pretty good. But let's talk about the example that you guys have all heard about, because this is one of those cases where actually the policy and the behavior of the president is actually affecting pretty much everyone around the world, and that's tariff. If you think about the way the president thinks about tariff, is a really big break from classical liberalism. For one thing, I mean, there are many reasons and many excuses that he used to actually use to exercise the use of what he thinks is the best tool in the world, imposing tariffs on friends and enemies. But one of them is that he actually literally wants to reorganize society, because he thinks that as it has emerged right now, it's not to his pleasing. And one of the things he has beefs about is the fact that the size of manufacturing is much smaller. Never mind that even in countries that have had trade surpluses, manufacturing employment has gone down quite dramatically. He and the MAGA type believe in things like that the U.S. has been deindustrialized, and in spite of the fact that actually we produce an enormous amount of things, and in terms of value, it's like we're almost at an all-time high. And so this kind of belief that actually it is his job to reorganize society is like actually that alone is a big break with classical liberalism. But tariffs, obviously, right, is something that is a big break with what we classical liberals have believed for the longest time. If there's one thing that economists agree on and still agree on, with the exception of Peter Navarro, who works for the administration, is the fact that actually protectionism is bad, and it's a tax, and it's a tax on consumers. It's actually not paid by foreigners, unlike what the administration likes to claim. I mean, the fact that these are Republicans who are for high taxes, I mean, in and of itself is kind of a contradiction. But there are also other elements of the use of tariffs. It's like it breeds the swamp, it breeds cronyism, it brings actually favoring your friends, right? If you look at the way he imposes tariffs, I mean, I mean, Liberation Day was a whole thing in and of itself of crazy, like abuse of power, right? I mean, it's like, I think the president really, truly believes that he has the power, not just to apply tariffs for, fake national security reasons, but actually what he really wants to do with tariffs is actually apply them, but also take them away and reapply them. And I mean, this is very new. This is a very new kind of protectionism in a way. And while markets haven't yet caught on to the fact that actually he really he wants to keep at least a 10% base tariff, they still like to believe in the narrative that ultimately this is all about negotiating better deals and then bringing everything back to zero. What the president, I think, really likes is actually the power that he feels he has. I mean, the ITC courts have said, he doesn't have it, but it's we'll see. There's an appeal, and we'll see whether it ends up before the Supreme Court. But what he really wants ultimately is this power to kind of make deals and bully countries and use tariffs not just for national security reasons, but for achieving all sorts of random things. Apparently, the Japanese were very surprised when they came, the negotiator, to talk with the administration about deals, and basically they were told by the administration, what can you give us? Which is kind of like a weird, it's a very different. But so, and then you look at all the companies that are actually getting deals. We saw this there were studies done during the first administration where we had tariffs. They weren't applied like this. I mean, they were like more like he was actually using, Section 232, wrongly, I think, but there's so much, Congress has delegated so much power to the president on the question of tariffs that he was applying all these tariffs, and then when you actually look at the system of exemption, there were lots of studies that found that the closest connection you had to the administration, the bigger the exemption, or even the existence of exemption itself. So it's in the sense that protectionism and tariff in particular, and the policy of this, and this fits in really well with what the administration thinks about, is actually breeds corruption, it breeds cronyism, it's really a very unfair system. I could go on and on and on. I want to touch on the fiscal responsibility side. This is kind of a break, this president, and it started really 8 years ago. It's like until now we've had, and I guess it's not for the entire history of the Republican Party. There's a really good book by Matt Continetti called 100 Years of the Right that actually shows you that in a way these Republicans are going back to their 1920s rules, selves. But until now, we kind of had at least Republicans who were actually talking about the need, which is a real need of reforming entitlements. The entitlements like social transfer in the American context, right? They're the drivers of our future debt. Just to give you a small idea, Social Security and Medicare, 2 of the 3, the other big one is Medicaid, if not reformed, and if in the next 10 years, Congress and whichever administration is empowered decides to actually keep benefits the way they are and not raise taxes, those 2 programs alone are going to require borrowing $116 trillion. $116 trillion, to put in context, is 4 times than the US has borrowed in the entire history of the US. Who's going to lend us this money? And considering that foreigners are actually reducing their lending to the US, and interest rates are really high, and the maturity, a third of the maturity of our debt is less than a year. 18% of our debt is a maturity of less than 3 months. So it means that basically we're really exposed to we really, really, really need people to buy our debt. And yet here we are with an administration that is actually kind of extremely committed to not reforming entitlement at all. And that is a break. It's a break. It's like, now he's different in his rhetoric, right? But it's not as if past Republicans were great on this in practice, and they're certainly not. Democrats were terrible too. In fact, he sounds like a Democrat, which I think probably he's more like. I want to finish on a kind of so I could go on and on all of this, another topic, but I want to finish on a positive note, because as bad as all of this is, there are areas in the administration's program and people he's put in place who are actually doing things where, if successful, it's a big if, because the things that they are doing, this administration is doing, is actually really, really, really hard to do, right? And if they were to succeed, it's possibility that if it's done fast enough, the first 2 things will matter less, much less. And that is, they really do believe in energy abundance, which is essential to achieve AI dominance. And they do really have a really right approach, I think, to regulation of crypto. They're less precautionary principle, and they're more permissionless innovation with still trust but verify. So they're not no rules. They're actually trying to really think about a regulated system that will actually promote crypto in a way that's not reckless. If this pays off, and again, it's hard to do because that cannot be done through executive power, it could pay off quite dramatically. And in a way, the strength of Donald Trump is that he's unbelievably lucky. He's lucky in his enemies, right? But it could be lucky because the team he's put in place in these areas are actually pretty impressive. Now, again, it's hard to do. It's and we'll see. But that's what I have to say on this. I'm trying to be more optimistic than those two.
Great, so 3 excellent interventions on the Trump era. And I wanted to give all 3 of you the opportunity to perhaps respond to another presenter's comments before I ask questions and before I open it up to our very erudite audience who will have harder questions than mine.
You're going to make the case that actually Trump trade policy is great.
No, it's disastrous. But Donald Trump is not consistent about many things. There's one thing he's been utterly consistent about his entire life, which is protectionism. If you go back to the 1980s, and you can see footage of him, and he's railing against trade liberalization. He's attacking the Japanese. It was the Japanese at the time. Now it's the Chinese. So this is, when people say to me, well, what explains this? And I think, well, in one way it reflects his mercantilist view of the global economy and the American economy, which that guy there did one of the best critiques ever of mercantilism. But he really believes that. I can't think of any other reason why he'd be so utterly consistent on this, because I think he's ideologically convicted of it. I've tried to think of, is this some sort of public choice issue, or there's some particular lobby that's really behind this? And there isn't. He really believes this stuff, and that makes it very hard. If you're a free market person like myself and us, that makes it really hard because that means the person is immune to, for example, empirical evidence about something like the effects of trade. That makes a very hard argument.
I want to ask, though, again, I mean, the difficulty with Trump is you don't know what he thinks and what he's going to do one day, the next, and so many of these trade things. Oh, I'm going to raise it to 50%. Oh, we're going to do 150%. But there's also an element of truth to the U.S. not getting a good deal on certain aspects. So the question I wonder is what he's doing, notwithstanding his protectionist or his mercantilist tendencies, may it result actually in freer trade?
No. No, I wrote an article about this right at the end, but just before the presidential election, when you had Scott Bessent, who is now the Treasury Secretary, who has a reputation for being one of the closet free marketers in the administration, although that closet seems pretty closed now. He was basically arguing, and we've heard this argument from other people, that this is a negotiating tactic. This is how you get deals, which is how he perceives himself. I'm the deal maker, etc. The problem is, as we've already seen, is that this introduces immense uncertainty into the US domestic economy and the international economy as a whole. And one thing we do know is that businesses, there's one thing they really don't like, and that's economic uncertainty. And so if you're a manufacturer in the United States, or if you're importing things from other countries because it's cheaper to do that than make them domestically, then I think you're basically in big trouble right now because you can't plan ahead with your expenses, your budgeting, who you employ. There are companies that have let people go.
But it's worth saying that it's a worldwide problem. Even if the tariffs are a tax on consumers, American consumers. So even if the goal was to actually lead to zero trade, zero tariffs, right? It's the wrong way to go about it. But there's also something that people fail to recognize. First, more than what we import are inputs in production. So it's really dumb for someone who claims to want to actually revive manufacturing, whatever that means, to actually make the cost of manufacturing more expensive. But it's also that a third of what we export and half of what we import are between related parties. So it means basically they're between American companies abroad, or like actually what he claims he wants, right? Like more BMW factories in the U.S. And they import because it's a global network. They import, for instance, all the engines come from Germany in the case of BMW, and to produce in the U.S. and they need it for the homogeneity of the brand and for. At the same time, they export a ton of the things that are produced in the U.S. for their other factories. So it's just the wrong, it's absolutely the wrong, but it's the wrong tool. But on top of that, I just don't understand why people don't see that ultimately, this is not Trump 1, this is Trump 2. The 10% tariffs baseline, they mean it. Look at the US deal with the UK. The UK, we have a trade surplus, and the trade deal maintains this 10% baseline. So I don't understand why people just now continue saying and believing that actually what they want to do is get the tariffs back to zero. Lutnick, who is the Secretary of Commerce, was asked, I think yesterday, by Senator Kennedy, if Vietnam came to you and said, we'll bring the rates, we'll remove all of our tariffs, everything, would you remove yours? And Lutnick said, I would tell them no, that's silly. And then he goes on to explaining why it's good for us to have tariffs. Like the US, now, again, the legal system may make us stop, and Trump may have to go talk to Congress to get his 10% baseline. I don't think he would get it. I think it'd be a hard pull, but this is what he wants.
So let me rephrase my question about this leading to free trade. No, I'm not trying to, this is not, I don't think it's necessarily going to do it, but what it has done, I've a friend who's a scholar on trade, and she says, this is great. Everybody's talking about trade now.
I'm so sick of talking about trade.
I know.
I really am.
But in a way, it what you're saying, Veronique, it's crazy, it's stupid, right? But it's putting it on the agenda that, actually, we should have even more trade, because notwithstanding what Trump is doing, we don't have more. I mean, most trade negotiations have been fairly frozen. We haven't had, the WTO doesn't work as effectively as it should do. You have some countries, very large ones, claiming to be developing countries still and getting preferential treatment.
Yeah.
So it's
but
forcing the conversation.
They want to withdraw from the WTO. So it's very unclear how much, and I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know what legal authority how it would happen and if it stands, but I think kind of all the rules are off about...
As a general rule, international law isn't international law, it's international morality.
And so,
you
and
don't have to really comply with any of it,
and
which is why Trump's just been able to feed it into the wood chipper. And the thing is, people think, that's America, it's a really powerful country. Of course they can do that. I mean, as is probably fairly well known, Australia abrogated the Refugee Convention. Yes, the really famous one in 1990. That's why its immigration policy is completely different. There were whingers from the UN at the time, and Paul Keating, the Prime Minister, did that. And recently, David Crisafulli, because human rights are very weak in Australia and they are enactments of state parliaments, he repealed the human rights legislation that Labor had introduced in Queensland because it was preventing his government from introducing mandatory sentencing for repeat offenders. Once again, criticised by the UN, and you will have probably seen the video clip of David Crisafulli in his very strong Italian-Australian accent, which is this really, really tough Aussie accent like this, going, the last time I looked, the UN didn't elect me Premier of Queensland, the people of Queensland did. And I'm just, yeah, mate. So, the general rule is and it applies to Keir Starmer with the Chagos Islands as well. Honestly, you don't have to do anything they say. You really don't.
But I think this gets to, one of the most damaging thing about the Trump administration, which, by the way, was started by previous administration, but it's really on steroids, is the fact that the whole system, our whole system, lives on explicit but also implicit rules of behavior. And I think, so he's doing damage to global trade right now. Trade in the US is roughly 20% of the economy, right? So it's not as big as we think it is. But what the real damage, I think, will be done is one where all rules and norms are broken in the way you behave with your trading partners, with your allies, within the country as a president. Again, he's only just doing this more. He's pushing all the limits. I tend to be one of the people who think that if stopped by the Supreme Court, most likely he will respect the rule. We'll see, I'll try to fudge it. I'm trying to be hopeful, but I think this is the real damage of long-term damage of the Trump administration. And for classical liberals, it really should bother us.
The only thing I'd quickly add to that is that this sort of behavior, we saw plenty of this behavior with the Biden administration as well. If you go back through histories, the Obama administration, remember with Obamacare, basically Obama threatening the Supreme Court, if you don't pass this, I can't be answerable for what will happen, things like that. You can keep going back. But
also there is a wider problem of non-compliance with court orders.
Right.
We're seeing that in the UK with the Supreme Court with the ruling on trans at the moment, and that's just an obvious example that everyone can see. There are at least a couple of NHS trusts in England, and I realise they run differently. I'm sure NHS Fife is still continuing to behave very badly. There is one major union, the University and College Union, and several universities who are just openly defying the court, and to the point where Rowling has had to fund litigation, and that is the only way they're going to be put back in their box. That should not be happening. You should not have that. You have a court ruling, an opinion from the Supreme Court, then you abide by it, and it doesn't matter what stripe you are.
So I want to open the floor to the audience. So I just wanted to touch on Veronique's last point about this trust issue. A few weeks ago, we had the ambassador from the Netherlands up here at Panmure House visiting, and you know, he interacts with a lot of European governments, of course, and he was very adamant. He said, it's this trust issue. We've lost trust in America. Now, I tend to be an optimist as an American that America will always be faithful and trustworthy. But I look at it from a very longue durée. So you could actually have a lack of trust for some time, but I think fundamentally the American people are trustworthy, and American society is, and our institutions are as well. So again, politics comes and goes. It's more the concern I have with what Sam mentioned is that you see this across administrations. And that's what I've always said, is that don't put Obama or Biden or any of these politicians on a pedestal as being necessarily good and virtuous, because often we see the similar activities and behavior across them. I mean, Trump is more crude often. You know, I mean, Obama will say that, you know, we're not going to follow it, and he'll do it in a really cool way, whereas Trump will, you know, sound like a Queens, you know, developer, which gets more, you know, news. But likewise, I mean, I think there's genuine concerns across the Western world, across Europe, or even in the UK, that we should we be trusting our politicians, and are they doing good for society? Now, I see hands going up, multiple ones. So first we're going to go to, first behind you, and then, so the gentleman with the jacket there, yes, you, and then, yes, and then after that, and then, thank you so much.
Yeah, you just said he's a lucky, Trump's a lucky guy. And I've just been reading a book called Lucky Loser. I don't know if you know the book. It's a couple of New York Times journalists. And they got the Pulitzer Prize when they found the tax returns. And they've done a lot of digging. And the whole story of the lucky loser is that he is a loser. I mean, he's been a terrible property developer. He was a terrible hotelier. He was an absolute disastrous casino operator. He was saved by the reality show, The Apprentice. That's what saved him, and that's what built his image up, and that's what makes people believe that he's worth something. But the big worry about it, if you look at his record over the years, he doesn't worry about debt. Debt just piles up. And often, he's gone bankrupt 6 times. So debt just piles up, and he doesn't care, because that's something for later, okay? Well, now the US is about to build up massive deficits. What's going to happen?
It's not about. It has built up massive deficits.
Yeah. It's not getting any better. It's getting worse.
Yes.
So have lots of other countries, though. Let's be. Yes.
Yeah, but the consequences of a debt crisis in the U.S. is enormous, precisely because
it's America.
all of the world holds so much treasuries, right? And so the consequences of a debt crisis in America, or even like, you know, I mean, the debt crisis could be, you know, sudden and really bad, but it's also bad if it takes the form of all this debt accumulation continues to drag on growth, right? And kind of like America not growing is a problem for everyone. And it's also the lack of growth. We know the people fail to understand the moral imperative of growth. It's because it's not just that it lifts all boats, but it's also, it breeds all the values that we all like as classical liberals. It breeds pluralism, tolerance, and all sorts of moral values that we like. And in America that is not growing, and in fact, I think we're in this situation precisely because we had very timid growth for the last 25 years. I mean, the last few years except it. I actually think that all the moral and cultural and behavioral problem that we're seeing is actually probably a product of this.
And the biggest driver of the United States debt is Social Security, welfare.
Yeah.
It's overwhelmingly welfare programs, and neither party is willing to deal with this, because the moment you deal with that, you start to become very unpopular.
Yeah.
But that's similar across.
Absolutely, absolutely.
All
The thing
here
is,
in
like,
Scotland.
the US is a little bit of a different system. It's like we actually have a moment of truth coming around 2032, 3, and it's going to depend on how fast we grow, because we have a system of trust fund. When those trust funds dry out, in theory, well, by law, benefits are going to be cut across the board for Social Security, a little over 20%. The way legislators are going to handle that moment, that crisis, is actually, I think, to me, it's a fiscal inflection point, because if they decide to be as irresponsible as they have been, meaning they're going to maintain the benefits, not raise taxes. I mean, I think they shouldn't raise taxes, but I think they should just cut benefits because, sorry, but seniors are overrepresented in the top income quintile, and I'm heartless. So, so anyway, it's a system that redistributes wealth from relatively poor and young to relatively old and wealthy. This is not a fair system. This is not. If they make the decision and just maintain benefit and decide to borrow, right, immediately investors will know that basically the US eventually will inflate and pay them back with inflation. Expected inflation means inflation today, and I think we could start seeing a deterioration really, really quickly. Because people think this is going to be a problem, this growth in debt is a big problem, but they think we'll have time. Actually, I may be proven totally wrong, but I actually think there is a chance that we're going to see that inflection point could actually start really seeing a deterioration.
In this administration?
In 2032 or something.
Okay. So a question. Wait for the microphone, please.
I don't need a microphone.
No, it's for the recording.
Oh, it's
for the
recording.
recording, yes.
So I'll try to be very polite, even though yeah. So you mentioned that you mentioned that people chose Trump because they lost confidence in the experts. And you specifically mentioned COVID. Trump was the president during COVID. It's his fault. And so how come that no matter how bad Biden was, how come that electing someone who is a convicted felon, like hates women, bad in business, and a liar, and a conspiracy theorist, how is that better? Like, how?
Well, I mean, it's, you're looking in these choices of bad and worse, worse and bad. So you're not facing choices that are particularly great. I do think that what I said about the radicalization of the left in America, I think that played a major role, and in terms of getting a lot of people who don't like Donald Trump, who would agree with everything you just said. They would say, yes, I agree with you completely, but I'm still going to vote for him because I see what the left has become in the United States. I really think that the Democrats' attempt to basically run someone who is senile as president and the rule of law problem associated with the border, I think that's what people came down to think about these sorts of things. And, one doesn't like that, but you can see the choice that some people were. I mean, I would have much preferred any of those two people to be running as an alternative. But I think that's the sort of calculation that people ended up making. And I mean, there are a lot of people who said, I'm just not going to vote for either of them.
Yeah.
Also,
Right?
Unfortunately, don't forget that the lawfare, those convictions that you talk about, I mean, this is effectively what made him the nominee. I mean, there were things that he had done that were absolutely worth going after him. But that's not what he was convicted on, and those were mostly seen by his ally, but also not just by his allies, are actually political tools to try to knock him out of the tickets. And so that, again, gave him power. And it was because of the lack of discipline of his enemies to actually put on lawfare that were BS. And sadly, rather than focus on the stuff where they had a really legit case. So again, it's just when I say he's lucky with his enemies, and when Sam's, it's like it's unfortunate, and in the end we're all the victims of this. But yeah, it's hard to kind of it's hard to overstate how much the left, in a lot of the ways that they've handled things, have actually basically kind of decided to die on hills of issues that were literally 80-20, where 80% of the country didn't believe in these things. And unfortunately...
And they're continuing down the same path. They haven't shifted their positions.
No.
I mean, Trump's election was not a foregone conclusion. I mean, I look at it as a massive failure of the Democratic Party to allow Biden to continue, even after he had promised that he wasn't going to run again. And then when it was clear that he couldn't run, to then effectively force Kamala Harris before they could have been a competitive primary. And it says nothing about who Kamala Harris is or her potential, but the fact that the donor classes, and it was very clear that there was backroom discussions where, well, we spoke to the donors in this, and then we decided to put Kamala Harris, and we had to. And so the Democratic voters didn't have the opportunity to choose a potentially better and more competitive candidate that could have beat Trump, right? It wasn't a foregone conclusion. And then they still are kind of doubling down. And the bigger problem is that's being revealed that everyone could see was the level of outright corruption in the last administration that protected Biden, that pardoned them all, his family, for crimes that we don't know, did they commit a crime, but they were pre-pardoned. And I think that shows there's a rot in the body, in the political system that, yeah, we might not like Trump, but
this is not a defense of Trump.
Yes, exactly, right. So this
and
is
that's
the thing.
The problem with the system. It's like
also completely independently of Trump, just to pick up the COVID point, which I think is a very fair one. We all know the line that a week is a long time in politics. The problem was all of this happened in sequence. First, there was Trump's behaviour at the beginning of COVID, which was not good. Then there was Biden's behaviour during COVID, which was also not good, but it came afterwards. And then after all of that, and the thing that everybody noticed globally, I mean, it's very odd for me to be on a panel like this. I have a policy of trying to ignore the United States to the greatest extent possible and pay attention to Scottish, English, Australian and Irish politics, because that's where my family lives and all of those kind of things. But it was impossible to ignore the footage from that debate. I'm sorry, it is the kind of thing. Has anyone ever had the experience of standing under a drain and it's raining and you're being sheltered and then the drain lets go and you get saturated through to your skin? I had that once in Dalry, and I was drenched through to my underwear, and of course it wasn't like Queensland, it was Scottish rain, so it was cold. That's what I think happened for a lot of people, and so that came to just dominate every single perception that they had. Now, I'm not American, I'm describing that from the perspective of someone who was living in Scotland or England at the time. But if that's what I saw in a foreign country, what did people in the United States see?
Yeah, you could literally, that night, you could watch these poll things they do where they're tracing how... So when Biden starts rambling and Trump says, what was his line? I don't know, I don't understand what he said. I don't think he understands what he said. The approval thing for Biden just started collapsing there and then. I used to think presidential debates didn't matter, but that one absolutely did.
It's like the Nixon Kennedy one where Nixon spoke well, but he was drowning in sweat, and that was all that people could see was the sweat. So it was that kind of thing.
Whereas JFK is this handsome guy saying this sort of empty, vacuous stuff.
By the way, it's also worth reminding people, because there's a narrative among Republicans that this was a landslide. It was no landslide.
Right. No,
it was no
decisive,
landslide.
but not a landslide.
It was, yeah. I mean, he got the popular vote, but it was, and he got, but it was no landslide, and they're behaving, like as if somehow they have a mandate to everything that they conceive and imagine, including all these tariffs, and which is kind of strange, because one of the things that actually American people reacted really against for the Biden administration is this inflation actually has made America really expensive.
Right.
Very expensive.
At least what Americans are used to.
Yeah. Americans don't like high prices, and this is...
we don't like high prices here either, so...
You have a higher tolerance for them, and so so he's putting these tariffs which are raising. It's not going to end well.
Okay, so I want to take some more questions. There's two in the row there, and then one in the front. So the first two. So first, here. So here, these two, the woman, yes, there, and then you, and then up in the front.
Hi, you touched on the issue, I think it was you, the donor class. And this is something, I'm American, and I grew up in the 60s, 70s, during sort of the golden age. And, you didn't have student loan debt, you didn't have an opioid crisis, you had local banks, you had, the good life. And what people haven't really discussed tonight, which I think is important, is, Reagan, Thatcher, neoliberalism, and what those 45 years have brought about in the Western world, if you like the collective West, which is people feel poor, which explains why Trump got elected. You can't afford what you used to be able to afford. A house. My kids are, in their late 20s, early 30s. They're not going to be able to have what I had. I'm a baby boomer. And people were voting against that. So and you mentioned donor class. I'm talking about money and politics. And the revolving door, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. You take COVID as a good example, the FDA, CDC, all these people, and contracts from the NIH, Fauci, all that corruption. That's just one example. Wall Street is another, big pharma. You can go on. And so there's been the rise of a corporatocracy. And so ordinary people are being squeezed out. There aren't market economics doesn't work anymore. It's all about monopolies and profiteering and monopoly profits and offshoring your profits. You see it here in this country too. So that, I think, is a real crisis of, if you want to call it Western liberalism. And then how do you then counter that? And you look at the rise of something like the BRICS, which is an entirely different economic model, which I think is the model of the future. Anyway, I'm just going to ask you to comment on the issue of money in politics and the corporatocracy and how that corrupts everything inherently.
That's an indictment of big government. It's not an indictment of classical liberalism or neoliberalism, right?
Money in politics, though.
But who gives the power? It's the government that actually has the power to distribute rents, to distribute subsidies, to distribute lots of benefits to seniors, and yet, interestingly, if this is really what people were voting against, they would be voting against. They would kick the Trump and the Biden and out, and they would be actually voting for the libertarian. That's not what they're doing. That's not what they're doing.
And it's the uniparty.
No, but I mean that's not what they're doing. People like big government as much as it saddens me. They will vote for the people who are going to promise to redistribute. The real problem is that actually the government is expanded to the point that that we're over $30 trillion in debt in the U.S. If gross debt is even bigger than this,
and all the foreign wars U.S. fights.
Obviously yes. It's like believe me. I were in charge.
Can I add something to that? When people talk about America, they often talk about America as this sort of radically laissez-faire economy where the state has a minimal presence in the society, where people are dying on the streets, etc., because they can't get. America is not a radical laissez-faire economy. It's a neo-mercantilist economy, with the type that he criticized, right? And what's neo-mercantilism? Neo-mercantilism is large businesses, even small businesses, doing deals with politicians on both sides. Whenever a big or even medium-sized business opens up a corporate office in Washington, D.C., what does that mean? That means they've moved away from thinking about how can we be more competitive and more innovative. What they want to do is secure favors from legislators. That's what they do. So I think my general point is that I look at the United States and say, yes, in some respects, it's freer than most other countries. It's still the most entrepreneurial country in the world. It's still the biggest capital-intensive economy in the world and all that. But it's not a sort of a dynamic market economy. I really do think neo-mercantilism is the way to describe it. But I think that applies throughout most of the world now. We're not living in market economies. We're living in neo-mercantilist arrangements which look like a market. You still have private property, you still have competition, you still have many of the things we associate with markets. But the notion that it's this sort of radically free economy is just not.
And it's intensifying.
And it's getting
The
worse.
size of the state.
I'll just make one little legal observation. Whilst it may have been correctly decided in US law, I do agree with you that Citizens United has had a pernicious effect. But that's partly because I think pretty much all forms of lobbying are morally bankrupt. It doesn't matter who they are or what your cause is. If I want to show you a morally compromised person, regardless of their politics, I will show you a lobbyist.
Well, but the solution to this is to actually restrain the power that government has to distribute rents. People are always going to lobby, and they're going to lobby all the more that the government has the power to give a ton to them. So any rules that try to restrain lobbying in the public, it's going to happen underground. The way to do it is to actually constrain the power. For instance, 0 subsidies allowed for anything. That's my dream. No private companies get anything, whether they're green, black, whatever. I mean,
if you give them the corporate welfare, they'll be screaming, won't they?
Well, this is why my ideas never win. But I think that you have to be very, very careful at the notion that somehow banning lobbying is going to get you where you want. As long as the government can distribute enormous amount of rents and subsidies and government favoritism, it will happen. It may not happen publicly. It will happen and so I think we have to be careful and actually put the finger on what the problem is.
Right. And I think if you said to Donald Trump or Joe Biden, this is what neo-mercantilism is, this is what lobbying is, if you said, and you pointed out that, they would say, what's wrong with that? They would absolutely say that's Joe Biden, his entire career is that type of behavior. Donald Trump, when he was a real estate mogul, not so successful as we know, did deals with the local government. I think the only thing he ever thought about when it came to the judiciary before he ran for president was who's in charge of the local court that's going to be making decisions about licensing and things like that. Development approval. So you have an entire political class that thinks that this is normal. And it's totally opposed to classical liberal principles.
And Republicans in the past, this is a challenge for me working on cronyism and trying to achieve my dream of 0 subsidies anywhere for anyone. Is that Republicans and even some Democrats used to actually be embarrassed about subsidy and actually will say in public that they're against corporate welfare. This has changed. This has changed. Republicans now actively believe that subsidies ought to be used to punish your enemy and help your friends. And that is really challenging because all the arguments I used to make in the past just don't work, are not appealing to anyone, literally. So I'm even further away from my goal. And it's just, we still haven't figured out how, I guess the solution is to actually kind of make the case to the American people that this is really profoundly immoral and, politics downstream of culture. So hopefully, but it's a long road, but it has changed. It has changed. They're absolutely not embarrassed to actually say that, so what? We're going to give subsidies to our friends and we're going to punish our enemies.
There was a question you had on the center.
Thank you very much. Given that the world seems to be moving to the right, is the greatest problem with Trump actually the fact that he's not very bright and J.D. Vance is, and is our greatest problem the way in which we still seem to treat Trump as if there is some sense of stability in him, when actually he seems to be dangerously unstable, and that from that instability, protectionism is his means of trying to ensure that all the toys in the world are kept and brought back into his own playpen.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of different things going on there. So when I think of Donald Trump, I see a populist, and he has there's some right-wing dimensions to that, but there's also some left-wing dimensions to that as well. So he's basically saying, I will do nothing about Social Security, I will not touch these. That's a left populist move. When he says things like, as Vera was saying, I'm going to reward these groups who support me, that's a classic populist move. That's so I think that's the dynamic that we see working here. We see it across the Western world now. I mean, it's really non-populists versus populists, and sometimes the non-populists win, and sometimes the populists are winning. When it comes to someone like a J.D. Vance, he has certainly acquired convictions and views that he did not have even 10 years ago. You could hear him, 10 years ago, you could hear him complaining about welfare. You could hear him saying people need to sort of snap out of this sort of cultural miasma and be more entrepreneurial. And he sort of did it himself as well. But he has clearly moved in a political direction that is very much a nationalist, populist direction, which is highly mercantilist in its economics. It has a more than an isolationist tendency to it. And he has a clearer, I think you're right, I mean, with Donald Trump, it's always very hard to say what he's going to say on a given day, or the way he's behaving with tariffs. It's on one day, it's off the next. The thing with someone like a J.D. Vance, I think, is that he would be much more intentional in terms of where he wants to go. Now, I'm not saying he's necessarily going to get the Republican nomination. There'll be people that challenge him. But when Donald Trump nominated him as his vice presidential candidate in 2024, I may have said younger, I said, this is a big move, because he could have picked someone who was more a type of traditional conservative Republican, so limited government, markets, these sorts of things, but he didn't. He picked someone who was very, very clearly articulating a new ideological line for parts of the right in the United States.
Wasn't it because Don Jr. said dead, picked this gay?
No, it is, but I mean, let me go, to be fair to this administration, if you owe to J.D. Vance, who, I mean, my feelings about him are well known on the populist stuff, but in the last few days, I've heard him talk about energy and about AI and about crypto. He sounds like a libertarian, like on these issues. So this administration is like all over the place. I mean, there's one thing that is sure about this administration is you cannot count on any intellectual consistency. It is really, I mean, you listen to him talk about how the precautionary principle applied to crypto is actually really bad. And he makes the case that my colleague at the Mercatus Center, Adam Thier, I've heard him made so many times about the danger of precautionary principle, the importance of a rule-based, permissionless innovation, nonetheless, kind of. And you're kind of like, it's not rule-based, but it's like permissionless innovation with the ability to actually rein in problems later. And it was just like, I mean, I'm glad to hear these are issues that are important, right? Energy is going to be, whomever wins the energy fight is going to be set. So, but they're not consistent. They're absolutely not consistent.
Right, so we have time for about, well, it depends if you keep your questions short. There's a gentleman in the front here had a question, and then I think after that we have time for 2 or 3 more, if you keep your questions very short.
Thank you very much for this very interesting debate. I'm a European who lived in America for a time, and I saw the debate, my toes curled, and I could see why, as you said, there was a big change. And I thought, well, okay, give him a chance. He's got some original ideas. But then, as time went on, from the Europeans are perhaps more concerned about Ukraine than about some of the economic issues. And I heard a man, the president of the US, say, well, you talked about lies. He said, Russia did not invade Ukraine. Now, is he the only person in the world who thinks that? I mean, we know it's... and he... Well, anyway, he told absolute lies, and that's a fact. But the question, I suppose, is: do you think? And then his attitude towards Russia, which is odd for a Republican party, given the history of relations with Russia. Very odd attitude there, which nobody seems to understand. But my question is, do you think that the fact that he's so obvious that he tells lies and so obviously pro-Russian, will that eventually erode his support? And will this dry down? Will it dry out?
Because this is a sort of consistent position he's had for a very long period of time.
Yes.
It's not. It doesn't seem to damage his popularity.
But it's also transactional with
Yeah,
him.
yeah.
So first, for one thing, I mean, Americans are tired of wars, so they tend to be with him on this. But it's also, for him, it's transactional. Look at the way it's evolved. Like since he made that claim and a bunch of others. But it's also like they went after, he wants a deal, right? He's made the case that he was going to get a deal, it would end the war on the first day or whatever, right? He wants a deal. He doesn't care. That's the thing about him, is like he's very transactional on most things, and he doesn't care what's inside the deal. He wants the deal so he can claim the win. And so he thought it seems to me that they thought at first the shortcut was to pressure Zelensky. And when Zelensky actually ended up, I'm talking totally out of my area of expertise, so please. But when Zelensky finally adjusted and ended up figuring out how to behave with Trump, and it became obvious that actually Russia didn't want a deal, then his posture, Trump's posture recently has been changing too. So where this is going to end, I have no idea.
I'll just make a little point about the history with the foreign interventions, because this actually does go to one of liberalism's lies, and it's a lie shared by all the liberal traditions. The failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were exercises in nation building, which is just a modern word for colonialism. Colonialism only sometimes works, and it works when you've got good raw materials, basically, and this has been true for colonialism since colonialism was invented, which is why there were certain parts that had once been bits of the Roman Empire that did rather better than other parts that had once been bits of the Roman Empire. I mean, that's really going back into history. A huge amount of the problem with all those foreign interventions was a belief that human beings are sufficiently similar across different cultures, religions, regions, language groups, and so on, to all find the idea of some form of Western liberal democracy, whether it is more controlled and somewhat more authoritarian, so you get the Singapore or the Australian versions, whether it's more dirigiste like you get in France, whether it's more liberal like you get in the US or here. But there was this belief that some version of that would catch on throughout the rest of the developing world, and that the wealthiest developing countries, the famous one being China, would also, as a result of their economies changing and becoming more like us, that their moral culture would also change as well. I mean, that has been, I think, irrefutably falsified. There is no such thing as universal liberalism. It does not operate at a level above the nation state, and that is why the United Nations has failed. Only some countries can do liberalism, only some countries could want to do liberalism. The attempt to export liberalism to every other kind of country in the world is how you finish up with ridiculous playgrounds like Dubai, which are nothing like the underlying culture, it's all pretend. It's all completely fake. I am old enough to remember, because this was when I was working in the Parliament in Australia, I am old enough to remember when you just accepted that there were certain Middle Eastern countries to which you could not post a female ambassador. And we have overcome that problem, but we have overcome it by dealing with a small group of governance elites in these countries who are as unrepresentative of their populations as Donald Trump is of the population of the United States. So this is what I was in my talk there about focusing on ethical systems with a big lie at the heart of them. This is a big lie at the heart of liberalism, and a really serious one, because it means we need to unpick quite a lot of things about our approach to the world. The problem with it is because of you got failures in Middle Eastern countries where the culture and religion and language really are very different, and it was such a catastrophic failure, is that even in countries where there are more considerable cultural similarities, of which Ukraine is a good example, the Americans have just it's the falsus in uno, falsus in omnibus. No, all foreign intervention, it's all crap. Go. Go fly a kite.
And another thing which I think is worth mentioning in this context is that the way that Donald Trump treats foreign policy is very much sort of 19th century great power politics. International liberal order, which was the sort of ambition partly after World War II, but then certainly after the fall of communism. This was sort of the vision that people like George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, even George W. Bush to a certain extent embraced. But with the Trump administration, and first and then with the Biden administration to a certain extent as well, and now with Trump too, we're in great power politics land. So saying the way that you just described the sort of behavior with Russia, that fits the classic mold of how...
Great game.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I said I'd had time for further questions, but I unfortunately... I lied, just like Trump would have lied. However, we do have drinks downstairs. Our panelists will be downstairs. I'll be downstairs. So please ask your questions. Unfortunately, those questions won't be recorded, nor will the responses be recorded. So ask away something controversial if you want. Not that we've had anything controversial said this evening, but it's okay because Panmure House is a home of social and economic debate that is open, it's tolerant, and we're not deplatforming anyone or canceling anyone here. If this was your first time here at Adam Smith's Panmure House, I hope you enjoyed your time. Please do sign up for our newsletter so that you can sign up for more events as we continue to build this place. You can follow us on YouTube. I have a podcast even where I interviewed Sam about 6 months ago and discussed Hayek. Issues around industrial policy. So please do follow us, spread the word that Panmure House is being brought back to life. And on that note, please go enjoy a drink downstairs and otherwise enjoy this beautiful Edinburgh June evening, even if it's a bit chilly. Thank you very much.